We acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, the gathering grounds of many diverse First Nation, Métis, and Inuit peoples, whose footsteps have marked this land and whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community.
Hello and welcome back to Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization podcast. I'm your host, Kelsey Howlett, and today we're joined by Dr. Joshua Toth. Dr. Joshua Toth is an associate professor of English and a Board of Governors research chair at MacEwan University. His work focuses on the end of postmodernism and the possibility of narratives that grasp otherness while maintaining its traumatic unknowability. He is currently co-editing the Routledge Companion to Metafiction and writing a new book titled Screens of the Self, or The Cinematic Fiction of Autobiography. All right, well, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
I wanted to start first by getting you to explain a little bit about your current research.
What I'm working on, well, I have multiple projects sort of running simultaneously, and they all kind of flow out of each other. So right now, like in the background of my own personal research, I'm editing this massive collection called the Routledge Companion to Metafiction. So it's, the Routledge is this big press, and it most big presses right now have some sort of either handbook series or introduction to series or something like that. And this one is on metafiction, so just anything that's self-reflexive, meaning like there's something about it, like in a movie, where it announces its own fiction in the moment of the actual narrative. So Deadpool is obviously the easiest example. Whenever Deadpool talks to the camera or moves the camera even like to look at it or something like that. So that's been going on, that kind of fiction or narrative in film, in novels, in plays. Well, I mean, it's older than Shakespeare. So, but in the latter half of the 20th century, it became sort of the main form of literature and narrative. So movies and especially novels. Movies sort of were a little bit slower to catch on to it. But by the time you get into the 80s and 90s, it's almost like if you're going to write a novel, you got to be self-reflexive. You got to be sort of metafictional about it. And then all these TV shows start coming out in the 90s too, like Moonlighting. That might be a bit old, but where there's a lot of winking to the camera. There's a lot of like self-aware sort of elements to the show that sort of reveal that the narrative isn't taking itself seriously in some sort of way. So we're doing this handbook. So at the sort of peak of, I don't know, postmodernism, so sometime around the end of the 90s, everybody sort of got exhausted with it, or academics seemed to get like, okay, enough's enough, we get it. It sort of seems almost feckless or apolitical, or it's very, well, it often gets referred to as masturbatory. Like it's not doing anything. It's just sort of constantly, all it does is talk about itself. So it kind of came out of vogue in academic circles. But what was weird was that it sort of exploded outside of academic circles. So once the internet got a hold of it, you're starting to see it in like now in social media and all this kind of stuff. But like every TV show like that comes out now, like from Community through Arrested Development, sort of starts it, but then you have like Fleabag now, and there's just tons and tons. Like it seems to be proliferating even more than it did at the peak of its era, which was the postmodern era. So we're kind of doing this handbook where we're trying to look at the long history of the whole thing. So we have some people looking at like Victorian poetry, elements of metafiction or self-reflexive sort of actions, even in poetry, and then going all the way up to contemporary things like Deadpool or something like that. But that's just taking a lot of time. I mean, if we're talking about the research chair, that's sort of, I'm lucky or glad I have it right now, because it's about 40 chapters. Each chapter is, about, 8,000 words. So we're going through first drafts right now and then returning them, and then we read them again, and then we have to introduce it and then arrange it. And dealing with academics is always a struggle. As you know, they often miss deadlines or don't show up to appointments, or just speaking for myself. So there's a lot of like sort of cat herding that goes on with it. So that, I don't know if that counts as research, but that's what I'm doing. And the reason I'm caught up in that is because my sort of background has always been in postmodernism and sort of the tension between realism. So, works of literature or film that try to present themselves in a way that sort of creates the illusion of authenticity so that you get lost in it, right? Like you suspend your disbelief. Like even something like Harry Potter, there's dragons and wizards and wands and all this kind of stuff. But when you read it, there's nothing about it that's like, oh, this isn't real. Like you're supposed to be worried Harry's going to die or whatever's going to happen, or, same with Lord of the Rings or any sort of even fantasy stuff. But in the 19th century and then coming into the 20th century, there was this real sort of push to sort of get beyond the sort of block that the storytelling apparatus actually created, and to get to something that was authentic, something that was real. And then when you get into the latter half of the 20th century, it's sort of like, well, that's never going to happen. So all we can really do is point out the fact that what you're getting has been mediated in some sort of way so that you're not tricked into thinking this is true, this is real, this is the same as reality. And so that's sort of where my background is looking at that, and then looking at how, around the fall of the Berlin Wall and then leading up to like 9/11, everything seemed to change because that idea that, let's just talk about how we don't know things, how truth is relative, how we're always sort of telling stories, we're not actually telling the truth, all of a sudden became a liability because, you find yourself in a situation where we really need political sort of direction, and, we need the sort of intelligent people of the world to not be just playing games with, self-reflexive devices, or we don't need Deadpool after 9/11 kind of thing, right? Mm. So there's a shift, and no one's really settled on what it was, but there was this real effort to get out of postmodernism and whatever postmodernism sort of signified in terms of apolitical, sort of feckless, sort of indifferent to actual issues or causes or things like identity or even race or anything like that. Like everything in postmodernism seems to be sort of presented as just a construct. It's all sort of a fiction. Like reality itself is a fiction. And so there's no real reason for doing anything because you're always making it up anyways. But after that, you get this whole group of writers, directors, people who make narrative, trying in different ways, not to simply go back and go, no, this is true. Like, because we know that doesn't work. We've sort of learned that lesson, but yet somehow get back to something real, something concrete. And it parallels another sort of sideline of my research is these parallel sort of movements in philosophy. So you have things called like object-oriented ontology and actor network theory and speculative realism. And they're all sort of efforts to get out of what's called correlationism. So the idea that we can only know a thing in the world, an event or an actual object or person, because we know it's phenomenon. It's sort of it's shell of experience. We don't actually know it, right? So we never really know things. We only know our sort of experience of those things, and that's all we can talk about. So a lot of these philosophies are like, well, that sort of makes everything very sort of human-centric, and that's one of the reasons why we're in this ecological disaster and these sorts of things, because we've kind of assumed that reality doesn't really exist without us. Like the only thing that is real is what we know to be real, and therefore the only thing that's real is human, right? Not that the world just does its own thing without us. And I mean, a lot of these philosophies get a little bit lazy and sort of problematic because they're just like, well, let's just assume we know what a rock is, like for real, and that rocks have agency, and and I'll tell you what a rock is, and then they describe a rock, and you're like, you're just back doing what you said, we've always been doing. So it's a little bit problematic because it's very hard to escape this once you sort of think about it philosophically or in the long sort of history of literature and narrative, it's very hard to escape knowing that everything we know is filtered and biased in some sort of way. But yet we want to sort of somehow find a way to return to real things, especially like, when you're dealing with a post-truth crisis, you're dealing with, all these sort of social media sort of accounts that are claiming things that have no justification in reality. You have people saying, well, sometimes the truth isn't the truth, or you have people saying, politicians saying that there's alternative facts. And a lot of that all just sounds like postmodernism, right? But it's been sort of weaponized, especially by the right, but not always just by the right, but it's been weaponized in order to sort of justify almost anything. So as soon as you're doubting something, there's nowhere to go because it just becomes a matter of opinion, right? So once you get into that world where everyone's just sort of, well, like, I'm not going to get a vaccine because I believe they don't work, and therefore that makes it true, then you're like, well, how do we get back to something, very strictly true without going back to a sort of absolute, almost like colonial kind of way of thinking where like everybody has to do this and, this is right. And so that's sort of the intersection of where I sort of work with literature and philosophy is how do we sort of overcome this paralysis of knowing without sort of going back to very hegemonic or sort of absolutist sort of assumptions about or claims about others and things and just the world in general, right? Because it doesn't help us to go like, oh, well, that's what a cat thinks, which we love to do. But, it's still just appropriating whatever unique thing that is and making it make sense within our world, our sort of narrative sort of universe. Oh, the cat feels sad or whatever. Sad's just a human concept. It doesn't necessarily apply to a cat, right? So how do we manage that? That's sort of, I guess at that base, that's where my research sits. And then I'm looking a lot at film and literature and philosophy, how it all intersects, especially in the contemporary moment. But I move all over the place. So.
Okay. Wow, it's actually like quite a lot, and which is not a bad thing at all. I'm curious, what inspired this research for you, like looking at film and literature and postmodernism, and how they all kind of connect with philosophy and all of that.
I always wanted to be an English professor, so that in part, so you get caught up, you do your undergrad, you do your MA. Like my master's wasn't in this at all, although it sort of was. My master's was in like Victorian literature and Oscar Wilde specifically, and Oscar Wilde is already sort of interested in these games. Like the only duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. Like that's Oscar Wilde quote. Mm-hmm. But when I got into my PhD, I kind of knew I wanted to do something in American literature, just because American literature sort of has this famous theorist, Frederick Jameson, says that postmodernism is a American but global phenomenon. So it, like America has this sort of strange sort of hold on the sort of cultural sort of imaginary of the West, especially, right? But maybe the entire globe. And maybe it's losing that a little bit now, but so it's very interesting to be able to look at something and see it as a microcosm of a global issue. So I was interested in American lit, and then I was interested in postmodernism, and I like in the 2000s or whatever, I was sort of like this postmodernism thing. I think it's run its course, and kind of quickly sort of realized that wasn't a new idea. Like, this was something I would have to, if I wanted to deal with it, I'd have to be a bit more original or look into it. So I just got kind of interested in that. And honestly, I always go back to The Matrix because it was The Matrix that sort of was like, what's going on here? And The Matrix seems like a postmodern movie because there's no reality, everyone lives in the Matrix or whatever. But you have this very weird, like almost like problematic, just blind spot in the movie. Like, Neo wakes up in this Zion where he wears a burlap sack and eats gruel or whatever. And, just some guy, standing over him when he wakes up and says, "Welcome to the real world." And Neo's like, "Oh, okay." And there's no sort of like, well, wait a minute. Why is the crappy world the real world? Like why why wouldn't, if I couldn't tell before, why can I tell now? Like, there's no sort of doubt. It's just, and then the Matrix is all about just going in and like killing people because they're imprisoned in the fake world, and that like they kill innocent people all the time in the Matrix. And I think I talked about this when I was doing this podcast before. But so that interests me is how really what postmodernism at its best is doing is saying like you don't have a justification to go out and kill people. Like just because they're not living what you think is an authentic or a real life, just because they're maybe not democratic or they're not whatever, that doesn't sort of give you this right to sort of go out and go, you need to do different, you need to be different, because that's just colonialism, right? Like that's sort of coming to North America and finding indigenous groups and going, well, you know, they're not living the way they're supposed to be living, so we'll help them out here, and which usually means just genocide. So to see something like The Matrix sort of almost repeating that, you know, but cast as sort of postmodern, like, oh, nothing's real, but yet let's go back to the real and we'll know what it is and everything will be fine and we can go in with guns blazing and take down everyone. And if there's some collateral damage, well, that's just the way it's got to be, right? So that interests me, and I think that sort of led to, so then I my thesis and then my first book was called The Passing of Postmodernism, where I was sort of looking at how there's different spirits, sort of like impulses. You can't just sort of say postmodernism was this or this, that there's actually this very utopian element to it, that it is quite political, and that element actually gets sort of lost after something becomes too dominant or too sort of pro forma. Like it became this thing where it was just, you could just check boxes and you would have like a postmodern novel or whatever. And you sort of lose this spirit that haunts it, which was actually radical and political, but that spirit passes on. So even though the thing dies, it kind of lives in this other way. So that interests me. So I wrote that book, and then there were elements in there that were about sort of race and sort of American identity. So then I moved on, and my second book was quite a bit different, and it was looking at the idea of the stranger in American literature and film and in philosophy, like how everything in American politics is built around sort of communities of exclusion, and that when you get something or somebody that doesn't fit in any particular community, that's when the communities start to like get sort of shaken up, or there's this sort of panic that gets built into it. So it's not just about like minorities versus, you know, dominant groups, but this idea of a stable identity is really what, at the end of the day, you find is sort of disrupting and upsetting the sort of logic of sort of racism and sexism, homophobia, whatever in U.S. politics. So I was sort of tracking the ways in which these sort of radically sort of unplaceable figures sort of move throughout movies and literature, and how they represent a sort of spirit of knowing another that you can't know, so that there's an ethics there, that if you can learn to embrace these figures that you're not trying to fix into various communities of identity, then you learn to be sort of infinitely hospitable, and sort of you get a kind of true democracy that you wouldn't have otherwise. So that there's this sort of latent sort of ethics in these depictions of characters that don't fit. And that ended, that book ended with an articulation of how an author might write themselves in a way to induce this sort of terror of the other, of something unknowable, while sort of encouraging a reader or a viewer to embrace that side, the side that they don't know, rather than the side that they do know. And it ended with a chapter on Bob Dylan and something I called autoplasticity at the time. And so I started to get interested in autobiography and forms of autobiographical expression that weren't, strictly speaking, autobiography. And then I did another book just on metafiction in a sort of post-truth age. And in order to talk about metafiction in the 21st century, you have to talk about something called autofiction. So autofiction has kind of replaced metafiction as a term, almost as if the new metafiction is autofiction always. And autofiction isn't very well defined, but it seems to mean forms of autobiography where the writer is inventing elements of their life, maybe overtly. It's not entirely clear, but like an easy example of this would be the film adaptation. I don't know where Charlie Kaufman, the screenwriter, writes himself into the movie because he can't adapt the screenplay he's supposed to adapt. So he creates a fictional version of himself plus a fictional twin brother, and they're both played by Nicolas Cage. And so that would be autofictional because it actually happened. He was supposed to be adapting. He was hired to adapt a book called The Orchid Thief, but he couldn't adapt it. So he ended up writing a screenplay about the fact that he couldn't adapt the book he was supposed to be adapting. So that became the adaptation. And it's this crazy movie where, most of the movie he's just trying to write a screenplay and then is writing the screenplay you're watching, which is a screenplay about how he can't write the screenplay and on and on and on. But there's a lot of novels like this, where you have the writer sort of, they're named the same. So like Ben Lerner is one that comes up all the time. So Ben Lerner is the main character. Ben Lerner is the author. But then like all these like crazy events are happening in the book that didn't happen to actual Ben Lerner, right? Mm-hmm. Although sometimes with autofiction, it's very slippery because what does a reader even know isn't true or is, and no one sort of pinned this down. And the fact is that autofiction, if you define it well enough or loosely enough, I guess, has been going on forever. Like, simple example is maybe Gertrude Stein, the famous modernist writer, has a book called The Autobiography of Ellis B. Toklas. And it's Ellis B. Toklas, who was Gertrude Stein's sort of common law partner, essentially. It's her autobiography. It's written first person by Ellis B. Toklas and about her life with Gertrude Stein. But it's mostly about Gertrude Stein. Like, the whole book is almost about Gertrude Stein. And then when you get to the very end of it, like after 300 pages, Ellis is saying, Gertrude keeps telling me I should write my autobiography. I should tell all this and write it down, but I just don't want to, and I haven't done it. So finally she said, I'll do it, and this is it. And so it's actually Gertrude Stein wrote the autobiography of Ellis B. Toklas, but as Ellis B. Toklas. So, and there's elements in it where you don't know, like, what sort of, what you can trust. But certainly, that all the interior sort of knowledge that is given in sort of autobiographical style isn't Toklas. It's Stein's interpretation of what she thinks Toklas would have thought. And so there's already playing these games. And you can go back even further than that. But for some reason, a lot of scholars think that autofiction is some new thing. Kurt Vonnegut has a book where Breakfast of Champions, where he's one of the main characters, but he's also the author of the book. And so he like goes up to people and he's like, by the way, I wrote this. I wrote you. And they're like, you're an old crazy man, go away, right? Or Slaughterhouse-Five, which is the story of Vonnegut in World War II. But he sort of transposes his identity onto this character named Billy Pilgrim. So it's happening all over the place. So what interests me is not so much that autofiction is a thing, or trying even necessarily to go like this is when it started, or this is when it this is why it's different than metafiction or whatever, but to look at this idea that some autofictions, and it has to be an autofiction, it has to in some way play with this tension between what's real, what we know about an author, and what's fictional. And sometimes it's very obvious. Like Richard Powers has a book where he trains an AI and basically creates and it's Richard Powers in the book doing it. Or Tim O'Brien has a book about the Vietnam War where, he's telling all these short stories, and then he tells this story about this guy that got killed by a landmine, and he keeps retelling that story and then telling you why he's retelling it and changing different facts. And then he ends the story by saying that was all a lie. But the only way you can know what I felt is if I keep making things up, because what really happened isn't what happened emotionally, or at least you wouldn't get it emotionally. So I have to like tell the story about shooting a baby water buffalo, or I have to do all these things that aren't real in order for you to know what's real. But he tells you in the story I know I just told this story about having shot this man and this dead body on the road, but I want you to know that that's a lie. It didn't happen. So when my daughter says, did you ever shoot a man? I can say honestly, yes, but I can also say honestly, no. And those kind of books where you really know what's going on are what interests me, but some are what I would call, and this is sort of where my research is now. So some you would call sort of perverse in the sense that they're very postmodern in the sense that all they're showing you is that the human identity is always just a construct of narratives. Like there is no me. There's just these scripts that I'm born into and then I can kind of manipulate. And so you get this sense that I have no real sort of responsibility to some core material self. And then you have other ones that do this, but they do it so as almost to sort of expose that truth that I'm always caught up in these constructs. But there's some element of me that you get when you know that what you're getting isn't me, and that thing that isn't me is retained, and that really is me. That really, like, there's this latent sort of encounter with something that kind of slips away, and because it slips away, it can hold on to itself. It doesn't get trapped in the sort of shapes or the forms or the narratives that it gives itself in. So Bob Dylan, I think, does this sort of his whole career, and that's where I started. And now I'm looking at films, and so part of my research chair is looking at films that are autofictional, which is kind of an impossibility. Like, you can't have an autobiographical film. So this is what's interesting me right now. Autobiography tends to get defined in literature according to what's called a pact. So when you pick up a book and it has somebody's name on the cover, and then you open it and you start reading it, and usually the book tells you, like, it says an autobiography or a memoir, right? Like you get, Will Smith's will, or whatever. And you open it, and the character, like the main subject of the book, is the author, Will Smith, say. And then you also know that the narrator is Will Smith as well. So author, narrator, character. The pact is, as a reader, you're like, those are all the same things. And so it's all aligned. And you're supposed to read it going, yeah, this is what really happened to Will Smith. Like, Will Smith's telling me the absolute unadulterated truth about himself that only he knows, right? But you can't do that in film because, I mean, as soon as you film something, like we're filming this here, it's sort of, it's after the fact, and it's either happening live, like a sort of journal, but you can't film retroactively one's life unless you were doing it your whole life. And then it would be more like a diary than an autobiography. But even then, it would be very manipulated. Like, you would have to shut the camera off, I assume, sometimes, or, do something, or I suppose maybe not. But the only real, like, good example I can think of autobiography is Howard Stern. He does this, right, like this. He wrote a memoir called Private Parts, and then turned it into a movie called Private Parts. And he plays himself from teenage years all the way up to the present, like the present of the movie. But it's very artificial. Like, well, first of all, he's not himself as a teenager. He's himself as an adult playing himself as a teenager. And then the people who he surrounds himself with, who are supposed to be real people, are actors. And, there's this weird sort of disconnect. There's also this element that you can't really have a narrator in film, not one that a narrator in literature can deceive you almost completely to the point where you think, oh, this narrator is the author. Like, this is their voice and this is them. Whereas in cinema, even if you have the main character sort of doing a voiceover, the real narrator is always the camera. It's always this sort of thing that's another step back, that's cutting and editing and these sorts of things. So what's interesting me is the way in which film, because it sort of constantly interrupts the possibility of autobiography, allows for a form of autofiction or sort of autoplasticity that print often can't manage as well, because print is so deceptive in how it sort of lets us just assume this collapse of author, narrator, character, whereas in film there's always this distance of the camera itself. So I'm looking at movies where you have these moments that are clearly autobiographical, but yet are offered in some sort of way that allow us to understand that there's some element of the autobiographical subject, whoever that might be, that we just can't know. So like I just finished writing an article on Cheryl Dunay's film, The Watermelon Woman, which is a movie where she tries to create a documentary about this woman that she's found in old U.S. Hollywood movies, who's just given the title Watermelon Woman, and she's just a black sort of stereotypical mammy character, which was common before even the 50s, I suppose, or even after the 50s. And so she's trying to construct this documentary. That's what the movie's about. And she plays herself. Dunay plays herself. But then part of the movie is a narrative movie, meaning like it's got lighting and she doesn't know there's a camera. She's not just a documentarian. And she starts having this relationship with this white woman and you know, just it's like a romantic comedy almost. But then parts of it are this documentary, and it ends after she's sort of assembled this life of this woman who she finds out was, you know, also a black lesbian working in Hollywood who had an affair with a white director who was a woman. And it all pieces together, and you're like, oh, I didn't know this was, and you really think it's real. And then at the end, she's just, I made all that up. Like that woman never existed. She's a fiction. The whole thing is a fiction. And she says, because I have to invent a position for myself, an identity that doesn't exist in Hollywood yet, which is a black lesbian filmmaker, and that they don't exist. So I have to invent a past for myself and a history for myself so that I can express myself to you. So that the documentary is actually then about her, not about, and it plays all these games with narrative and documentary, and it sort of blurs the line between the two, what's real, what's fictional. But at the end of the day, it's the fictional side, the side that tells the story of Cheryl's sort of own experiences making the documentary, that you get this sense that we're actually seeing this real person, because it's sort of caught up in all these fictions in all these different ways. And that there's some element of it that can't be expressed, that there's not available tools to express it. So it kind of slips away. And like it kind of, the whole movie kind of fails. She breaks up with her girlfriend and everything. So I'm looking at movies like that. Or Samuel Fuller has this movie called The Big Red One. And Samuel Fuller was this pseudo Hollywood director who often was associated with primitivism. Like as if he didn't know what he was doing. Like his movies are so random, and like he'll make like these weird noirs or sort of shock movies, and it seems sometimes like he just doesn't even know like what the 180 degree rule is, or you know how to edit. But at other times it seems like he's doing that on purpose. And he made this movie called The Big Red One, which stars Mark Hamill, like Luke Skywalker, about World War II. And it's clearly autobiographical. He was in the Big Red One, or the 1st Infantry in World War II. And one of the characters is a writer. Fuller was a writer. At one point in the movie, one of the characters is reading a book, and the other character comes up to him and says, "What are you reading?" And he goes, "This book." And he goes, "That's my book." And he goes, No, I bought it. It's mine." And he says, No, I wrote it. And it's clearly the book, just slightly, the title's just been altered slightly, that Fuller had written before World War II, and then that was published and turned into a movie by his mom while he was in the war. And like all these things start to align, but then it all comes together at the end when they liberate a concentration camp in Poland. And that actually, Fuller was there. He liberated the Falkenau concentration camp. And the way he films it is almost like you think the whole movie's leading up to this great event of sort of like Schindler's List sort of level depiction of the Holocaust. And he barely gives you anything. Like he gives you this weird sort of rhythmic slamming of doors opening and all of the soldiers seeing something they can't like comprehend, like just people, darkness and sort of bodies, and just he just doesn't show it. He won't show it. And the movie ends with Mark Hamill finding a German soldier in the ovens, hiding in the ovens, and then he just shoots him like endlessly, and the camera just sits on him. And what's interesting about it is that this is one of the most traumatic personal experiences one imagines Fuller ever experienced. And when he was in the war, his sergeant knew that he was a filmmaker and a writer. So he actually said, and this was quite common in World War II, there was this real sort of sense, especially among the British and the American sort of groups that were liberating these camps, that they had to record it. They had to get it, footage of it somehow, because it would get either erased or ignored or something like that. So he had Fuller film just like bodies and like just you can imagine just the horrors, and try to capture, and also capture the fact that the town that was right nearby, they had gone and forced the townspeople to come and see, and then actually help with the burials and sort of the sort of moving of the bodies, and which was also a sort of common thing. And Fuller does all these things where he's trying to document it, like realistically what he's seen, and he like does a 380-degree pan, and this is all archived footage. And it's almost as if the movie is like his attempt to do it again, but he realizes that the sort of sincerity that he approached it in the moment, like where he tried to like make it as if he wasn't even there, like there was no bias, there was no subject viewing things, like even the 360-degree pan, there's this like he's like a locust that he can't get rid of himself at the heart of that thing. So he makes this movie where he's the subject is part of what he witnesses, and he can't like disentangle that, so that the narrative and the artifice of the film is actually what he uses to get to the sincerity, the sort of encounter that he had in some sort of authentic way. And in fact, he actually seems to think that not showing it is showing it more than otherwise, right? Like offering this sort of Hollywood version of a concentration camp, like in the first X-Men movie or something like that, isn't going to help anything. That was long, but that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, no, that's more than okay. You've brought up your research chair quite a few times, so I just wanted to ask you about that. How has your Board of Governors research chair impacted this current research of yours?
It's just made it easier to do somewhat. I mean, I've been telling people that, the main thing with the research chair is I get time off teaching. That's sort of what it gives me, and some funds to travel a little bit. Like I'm going to a conference and I'll be presenting on some version of probably The Watermelon Woman or these Todd Haynes movies I might look at. But so that and the time. So like doing the editing that I'm doing right now, and then I just wrote an article and I finished one before Christmas. I mean, at MacEwan, especially where we're teaching, most faculty that are have a teaching research service position, so that's tripartite is called, are teaching three classes each term, and often first year classes, so they're often quite large because we're an undergraduate institution. So unlike the U of A, where you would have less courses and often less students in a class, you're really like, just in terms of marking, it's almost impossible to do any real serious research or writing midterm. Like I mean, you can do it, but you kind of have to. Kind of have to squeeze it in on the weekends, and if you have kids, you're doing it at their sporting events or whatever. So with this, there's just like right now, I'm only teaching one class this term, so I just have time or more time. But I've been saying to people, I don't understand. Like I feel busier than when I didn't have just one class. But I think that is just the coincidence of things. I'm also in the background. I'm part of an organization called the Association for Philosophy and Literature, which is this international organization, and I'm sort of in charge of organizing these international conferences. So I'm doing that too. Like I'm getting ready for a conference in Frankfurt, and then I'm setting one up in 2026 for Brazil, and then another one in Granada in 2027. So there's all this stuff that's sort of just compounding. And just having this time to sort of get all my ducks in a row, that's really just the time of it. I don't think the actual like title or anything does anything. I don't know, maybe, but like I mean at this point I don't want it to do anything. I don't want anything else. Like did a keynote last year, and I don't know if I'd already been name this, but I think they offered me the keynote before that. So that could change like that, like maybe that somebody if they look me up, they see this, oh, he's a research chair for a year or two or whatever. But it's just really the time, I think that and having extra funds, it meant also that I didn't have to apply for federal funding because I have this little pool of funds now that I can use for RAs or for travel or whatever. So it sort of delayed me having to worry about getting another federal grant. Like I've had that before, but once it's gone, then you're just sort of at the mercy of whatever funding group might be on campus, right? Like you have to just apply and hope for the best. Yeah. And then we have some like sort of PD funds or whatever that we can use, but. Yeah, just time. Time is really nice. So like next term, I'm going to do an online course, and I'll technically not have to be on campus for a semester. So all the things I've been kind of talking to you like about the Fuller and Dune, and I also did some work recently on this really weird Francis Ford Coppola movie about vampires, which also is oddly autobiographical. And probably next term, then when I just have the online course, I'll be able to assemble that into a sort of book prospectus, so that it'll eventually be a sort of book on autoplastic cinema or something. I don't know what I'll call it. But.
I also wanted to ask, because that term has come up quite a few times, this autoplasticity. Could you just define that for us quickly, just for people listening?
Well, I mean, I'm sort of I've been riding a sort of plastic train for a while now, or the idea of plastic. So, like in the last book I published on metafiction, I sort of make the argument that contemporary metafiction, or a lot of contemporary metafiction, manages something. Metafiction used to be called historiographic metafiction mostly, if it was dealing with history. And that's from a famous Canadian scholar, Linda Hutcheon, came up with that really awkward term, like there's this classic sort of academic sort of speak, historioplastic metafiction. And she did it, like she'll tell you, she did it sort of as a joke, like it was sort of like the sort of using academic language to say this thing. But it's actually quite accurate in the sense that what she's saying is that there was this whole wave of metafiction that was telling historical fiction. So it was, about the Victorian era, or it was, telling the story of the Vietnam War or something like that. But it had a historical element to it. But then it was using these self-reflexive devices to sort of show how history is always complicit in its contemporary sort of biases, so that you never really get a pure history. So she called it historiographic, meaning about history, graphic, written metafiction. So historiographic metafiction. So I don't know when I accidentally got obsessed with the German philosopher Hegel. And in part because a lot of my work was always focused on a French philosopher named Jacques Derrida, who invented deconstruction, which you've heard that word, like let's deconstruct that or whatever, which never is what actually Derrida meant, and that always upset him a little bit before he died. I mean, by the time he died, he was seeing like recipes for deconstructed rabbit and different things like that, but it's not what he meant. And Derrida always gets lumped into to this group of post-structuralist thinkers who often are sort of lumped together with postmodernists in the sense that they seem to be nihilistic, like that Derrida says, or people think he sort of claims that there's nothing outside of language. There's no reality outside of language, sort of this. And so all you can do is sort of take apart language to show how it works and how it affects our understanding of reality. Like that's kind of this very basic version of it, which I always thought was kind of BS. Like if you really read Derrida carefully, which is actually very difficult because he writes in a way that intentionally makes it impossible to understand what he's saying, but that he has this sort of very political agenda at the back of his writing. But right around the time he died, his last student, this a French philosopher named Catherine Malabou, published a book called The Futures of Hegel. And basically, and he wrote the preface to it, and she basically said that Hegel, who was this idealist German philosopher who long predates Derrida, and who Derrida really started his career by saying, like, look at this guy, look at how he sort of makes this kind of claim that we can find the truth, like we're moving towards some final state. And Derrida hated the idea of a final state, right? Like I mean, he was an Algerian Jew, who grew up, through World War II. The idea of like a final solution or anything final just rings of just terror, right? And he called this teleological, so meaning that it's sort of this false idea that we're moving towards some perfect state. But as soon as you have a benchmark, then you can cut off anything that doesn't fit that benchmark, right? Like that's the ultimate problem of a heaven or a sort of ideal place. And Malabou basically says in her book that everything Derrida is doing is actually just Hegel was kind of doing already, and that if you read Hegel differently, he's not what we think. He's not this sort of teleological thinker, and that his whole project is actually structured around what she calls plasticity. And so that there's this idea of this sort of like we're always negotiating a real, and so for Hegel is much clearer. He's much more idealistic about what's real than Derrida seems to be. But what Malabou argues is that he actually allows us to get past Derrida without sort of losing what Derrida said, because Hegel brings us back to material reality. It's just that material reality is plastic. So she talks about plastic like the word meaning all these different things, that it's something that takes form, it gives form, but it also is like implicated in like plastic explosives. So it explodes form. So anytime you sort of narrativize something, make something understandable, a person, an object, an event, you're sort of giving it a shape through those language acts. But that's not the thing itself. It's just that thing yields to that shape. Like, so the best example of that is like a ball of plasticine. You can infinitely shape it. You can push on it. You can rebuild it. You can squish it. And there's an infinite number of computations for that one ball of plasticine. But yet its volume is finite. It's static. You can't change what it is. Like it is real and it's there, and it's not. It can't be. Not just anything can happen to it. It weighs what it weighs, and it is what it is, and it has this concrete sort of finite status, but yet it also yields infinitely to the way in which we sort of experience it, like touch it, move it, shape it. So if you think of language and meaning in the world, in the human world, as sort of touching this ball, that's what's happening. And that doesn't mean that thing doesn't exist and that it doesn't like push pressure back. Like it doesn't, because it does. Like that real things happened. and they can only take so many forms before those forms exceed the actual capacity of whatever that thing is to suit that form, right? Like, if your ball plasticine is bigger than this cup, you can't stuff it in there. Like, you just can't. It's not ever going to go in there, which means that there is something true. It's just that truth is always malleable. It always is yielding, and also giving. Like, it gives back shape. Like it sort of like that, the sort of fantasy of the sculptor who says that the marble, it's not that the sculptor makes the marble into something. It's that the sculptor finds what the marble is hiding, right? Like, that's more. So the marble is as much a part of the sculpture as the sculptor is. Like, that they sort of are implicated in the moment of the creation. So that idea, and that Malbu does all kinds of stuff with it on her own. Like, she's very interested in material science. So, like, neuroscience and biology, and the way in which biological elements, especially with the brain, have this plastic sort of component to them that allows them almost to take on infinite numbers of sort of permutations. So she has a whole book where she looks at very traumatic accidents, like physical accidents, where people, like, their bodies are still there, all the sort of biology and all the elements of them are still there, but they've completely changed. Like, they're not the same person anymore at all. And she's sort of very interested in this idea that this thing is still real, this person is still there, but they're not that person anymore because of whatever's happened. So that idea is tied to Hegelian, what are called dialectics, and a word in, I won't say the German, but a word that gets translated as sublation, which is a sort of negation of a negation. So you have in Hegelian dialectics this idea that there's something that is, and then there's this thing that sort of contradicts it. And then in sort of simplified Hegel, this becomes a synthesis. So the outcome is thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which then, and it goes on and on until it gets to this teleological end, what Hegel seems to call absolute knowledge. But another way of thinking about it is that what Hegel, and this is sort of how Malbu reads it, is that through a negation of something, so if you think about it narratively, the narrative negates the real thing, the story or the description of any event or person, even like gender classifications or racial classifications or something like that, actually negates the thing itself, because it's not it's a representation. But that when you think about sublation, what happens is that another negation happens, which negates that negation. So it's not quite the same as like getting rid of the negation. It's like that crazy academic talk is sort of important there. And it pulls the thing through the negation so that it actually grasps something by letting go of it, so that you hold on to something because you don't have it. And that's this sort of, then that for Malbu plays into this idea of plasticity. So when I say autoplasticity, or when I'm talking about metafiction, I change Hutchins' historiographic to historioplastic, meaning that history is a plastic thing. It's real. It happened. It's in postmodernism, the graphic is like everything is written, everything's caught up in language. But if we shift the emphasis to the fact that the history is actually before what's written and it's plastic, then the historioplastic metafiction affects this kind of sublation. It shows how the story of the history negates the history in its truth, but then it enacts through these self-reflexive devices a second negation, which then shows us that we've lost something, that there's something there that we didn't get. And once we're aware of that, once we experience that, then we actually get it, because we're not holding on to it in its false narrative form. We're holding on to it as something that somehow transcends that form. And I mean, to get into examples would be too complicated, but with autoplasticity, then same idea, but carried on into just specific autobiographical accounts. So where like Curb Your Enthusiasm, in terms of like a film kind of thing, is maybe the most accessible, where you have Larry David living his life as Larry David, the writer of Seinfeld. He moved from New York to LA. That's what the show is about. But everything about the show, from its improvisation, like it's always done in improv, to its limited camera work. There's usually only like one camera, maybe two cameras in a shot, to just the ridiculousness of how he acts. Creates this sort of tension between the fact that we think we're seeing Larry David for real, and we really are as Larry David, but then we have this sort of clear cancellation. But because the cancellation keeps being shown to us, it kind of gets doubly canceled, allowing us this sense that we don't know Larry David, but yet we're experiencing him in some sort of way that we can't completely articulate, that sort of transcends the myth of an understanding. Whereas like a bad memoir, like something like Jared Kushner would write or something, gives us like, verbatim dialogue, and like as if somebody remembers. Like I think Will Smith's autobiography begins with, "I remember it was a sunny day and my father said to me," and then quote like the thing his father said to him on that specific sunny day when he was 10 or whatever, as if he could possibly get those words right. But yet when we read it, we're like, oh, wow, you really said that, whatever. Whereas with Curb Your Enthusiasm, you never get that. But you get weird things like between the one season and the next season, Larry David got a divorce from his wife, who apparently cheated on him. I don't know if like a pool boy in real life. I don't know, something like that, something weird. And then in the show, he divorces his fictional wife across those two seasons. So like just raw from experiencing a divorce, he has a whole season having divorced his wife in the show, and then trying to do a Seinfeld reunion as a way to get her back, and then messing it all up and confusing himself with George Costanza, who was his version on Seinfeld, and so on and so forth. So this idea that there is a real Larry David, and what he's showing us constantly is that you can only sort of access me through these false sort of representations of myself, but then shows us that so that we know that those false representations of him aren't him. And we get this sort of double sort of gesture that allows us into, whereas in the postmodern sort of version of it, it's just sort of like just goofiness, like Vonnegut saying, I'm your author kind of thing. And there's no sort of like, what aren't you getting from me that is me and is true and authentic and real. So that's plasticity. But I mean, one way of it's just like plastic, like, like meaning malleable or,
Amazing. So I just have one last question for you before we wrap up. And that is, what advice would you give to our listeners? And it doesn't have to be like specific to your research. Just what advice would you give to like faculty or staff or students?
Advice?
Yeah.
I don't feel like I'm in a position to give anyone any advice ever. I don't know if this is maybe a plea or advice, but I think it, in terms of that these sorts of positions, if that's what we're kind of here to talk about, like this research chair or something like that, are so important, especially at a place like MacEwan. I really believe that MacEwan is a teaching institution, but I really believe that the quality of my teaching is very much tied to my ability to be doing this kind of work that isn't clearly or overtly classroom activity. Like in some cases, it's not stuff I can even do with undergraduate students, but at the same time, it informs and keeps me up to date on such a level, even at the first year level, that I become, I think, or like to think, a better teacher. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's sort of all that's really important to me, like is being in the classroom, working with students. So with most grant, like everything in academia tends to fall around grants and applications. You're always applying for things, to always just be applying for these things because, one, it shows the necessity of them and how important they are to us and our ability to do our work. I mean, especially at a time like what we're seeing in the U.S. I mean, in some ways is infected into Canada, but I mean, you're seeing this diminishing sort of sense or sort of willingness to sort of see the necessity of research or expertise, or this idea that there's people who are sort of dedicating their lives to very specific problems or sort of research acts in order to try to access, truth as best they can, whether in fields of science or humanities or social sciences or whatever, that, we have to keep, sort of constantly sort of demonstrating and sort of advocating for the necessity of that work, even when it seems, and for me, I mean, in the humanities, there's always this sort of like, why? So what do? You read books, you watch movies, you talk about movies. But it's so interesting. I find that humanities departments, for instance, are struggling across North America, throughout the West, at the very same time that narrative acts are proliferating to such a degree, like in terms of YouTube, social media, streaming services, all these things, movies. We're just seeing this huge, like everything, and everything is about narrative, like tell your story, like even outside of entertainment. Everything is about telling a story. Even business is like, you sell things by telling a good story. So the importance of the way in which we describe the world and turn it into a story, like everything gets turned into a story. For me, then, I mean, speaking specifically about humanities and not just generally, it's so important that people are actually, have the time and the sort of space and the funds to really be looking at how we're telling stories, who we're telling them to, and what effects those stories have on people. And I think, oddly, that's actually something people really want to hear about. I mean, my son, who actually, like most of his generation or a newer generation, is reading less and less, is sort of even maybe watching less and less movies, is desperately interested in it. Like there's all these YouTube videos and TikToks and Instagram sort of things that are just associated with like talking about what's the best movie ever, what's the best video game ever, what's the best whatever, and why. Why is this a good story? Why is this a bad story? And everyone has an opinion. So it's something that seems to be very current and of almost grave importance to the world, but yet is sort of being sort of slowly sort of eroded in academic institutions and increasingly, sort of being sort of sidelined by, something that very overtly seems like a skills-based degree or program. But what that means is we have less and less people really, understanding the way in which their world is being sort of shaped for them. And thinking increasingly that they can just sort of go it on their own, and that just because it's a story, it's just a matter of opinion, and I like it or I don't like it or whatever, So, yeah, I guess advice is to take this stuff actually deadly serious. I think to advocate for each other and ourselves that something like me having this research chair is such a sort of gift, even if it's for a couple of years, to be a little bit more intensive even than I would be otherwise, to get into this stuff, which I think otherwise, I mean, yeah, like how sometimes it's hard for me even to take it seriously when I'm, worried about my kids, getting to school and getting to swim practice or whatever. It's easy to lose, and I think we're already in a bad state, I think.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's the best I can do for that question.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for joining us today and talking about your research. I'm excited to see where it goes and how your the Metafiction manuscripts turn out.
Yeah, we don't want to talk about that just yet. Just coming. It'll get there. But yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Well, that's all we have for today's episode of Research Recasted. If you want to support this podcast, you can visit Research Recasted on your favorite podcast platform to find new episodes every 2 weeks. Also, don't forget to check us out on Instagram at Research Recasted, where you can leave us a like, give us a follow, or send us any follow-up questions that you have from today's episode. This has been Research Recasted, the Knowledge Mobilization Podcast, brought to you by the Office of Research Services and the Faculty of Fine Arts and Communications at MacEwan University.